Hello my friends! If you're new here, my name is Rachel and welcome to the channel, and if you are returning, hi, welcome back. It's so nice to see you again. Today we are working on an area that has been highly anticipated and one that I am incredibly proud of. Let me just take a moment to say that this build was inspired by a structure created by 𝒷𝓊𝓃𝓃𝓎 here on YouTube. I've linked her Instagram and her YouTube in the description box down below. If you want to see the original rendition of this build done in a more medieval summery style, I'll leave the exact video below as well. Before we jump into the video, be sure to subscribe to the channel if you're not yet subscribed, as I would love to have you join our cozy community, and without further ado, let's start building. Like always, let's put on our hard hats and get to work laying all of the pathing down in this area. We're actually starting today's build next to where we left off on the right side of the town of 𝒷𝓊𝓃𝓃𝓎 in last Sunday's speed build, and if this is your first time watching, then I'll be sure to link the island playlist below so that you can catch up on everything we've built so far. Last Sunday we tackled a huge portion of the island, and while this area isn't nearly as large, it is just as involved. The spot that we're starting with is this little transition between the city and the wilderness beyond, so my main goal was to make this feel like a location that may have been cleared by those who use it to come into town from the woodlands toward the back of the island. I feel like it makes more sense to leave these little signs of civilization on the outskirts of the town instead of immediately just planting as many trees as possible to drive home the idea that we are in the wilds now. While the pathing and the placement of everything might seem a little effortless, let me just say that this island has officially tested my design capabilities and made me question everything. This past week I hit such an intense burnout that I almost wondered if I could even keep going with 𝒷𝓊𝓃𝓃𝓎. I've said many times in the past that I want my channel to be a place with an honest, realistic look at what designing in Animal Crossing is really like, and while I would love to show you my initial designing endeavors when I'm planning out an area, these builds can take up to 2 weeks for me to fully get right, so my speed builds are usually just recreations of my end product. I would love to showcase every minute of designing in this game, but I have a lot of indecisiveness and I can spend hours just picking up and placing the same items over and over again. I've talked a lot about streaming and would love to stream these initial designs to really showcase how I go from a blank space on my island to something like this, but I am still in the process of saving up for a microphone and battling with myself on if facecam is something I want to dive into with my streams. I haven't yet figured that out. Back to the point at hand, the reality of these designs is that they're hard. Sometimes you hit the inspiration jackpot and it all just comes together so effortlessly, but I would say more often than not it's a struggle, and this island is definitely no different. I think I see now why so many creators shy away from winter islands, because it really does feel like whether it's just the season or the theme that I've chosen, I am doing these same areas over and over again with only a slight variation in the placement of items, but it's essentially all just the same thing. I had a list of builds for �𝓊𝓃𝓃𝓎, but that list is already pretty much complete and was comprised mostly of just villager house ideas and not really anything substantial besides the town itself. I'm featuring this area first in the speed build, even though it's so far removed from the churchyard down below, because this build, while not in the same sphere, is just as important to the design process as the things that come together down below. I built out the church and then could not for the life of me figure out how to decorate around it, so I actually abandoned the build and moved up here, thinking that this Sunday I could landscape around the sunken waterfall that you can see off to the corner. In a weird twist of fate, working here for a bit and taking that break meant that whatever mental threads were tangled became free enough for me to figure out what to do near the church. It's so interesting seeing how our brains work and how in the moment it may feel like a monumental roadblock is in the way, where it's easy to convince ourselves that we're these creative imposters who've never had an original idea in our lives, which, first of all, there is no such thing as an original idea, no matter how much society drills into us that it's wrong to be cliche or unoriginal. I will say here on the record that I love cliches, I love tropes, and I love reading the same stories over and over again. There is absolutely nothing wrong with taking inspiration from something that already exists in our world, as long as you make it your own. And honestly, as a creative person, the biggest compliment I could ever receive is knowing that something I poured my heart into gives someone the passion and the courage to pour their own heart into something as well. So it's easy to look at moments of creative blocks as a sign that you're not a true artist, but that is just not the case, because with enough time and enough space to breathe, those threads untangle and we find ourselves at the canvas again and again. I am now placing down the first bits of decoration in this area and just using a lot of the more rustic items that I have at my disposal. I always make sure to leave 4 open tiles in various spots around these forested areas as well, just to save room for things like decayed trees and giant vines to help give some more realism and definition between the cedar trees and the hardwood trees. A lot of the items from the 2.0 update have been huge for adding character and charm to different builds, and honestly I worship whoever decided to add the items to the game. Part of me feels like the items from the 2.0 update were actually meant to be shipped with the initial release of New Horizons, especially considering how sad and empty and lacking of items the release of the game was, which, don't get me wrong, I love the game, clearly, but I do wonder just how rushed the Animal Crossing team was at release. For those who don't know, New Horizons release date was originally set for 2019, but was delayed due to concerns of the game not being polished enough, and then was subsequently released in 2020, which was probably the best delay outcome that Nintendo could have ever asked for. I honestly don't think that the franchise would have survived another release, if I'm being honest. If it didn't have the influx of new players that came with New Horizons, I feel like it is kind of a big question mark. While New Leaf was definitely an industry success, it only sold 13 million copies. Meanwhile, New Horizons skyrocketed up to 40 million in sales and became one of the biggest games for Nintendo. I would love to get into video essays and doing deep dives, along with my speed builds, of course, and just making video essays about topics like this that have definitely sparked my interest. But we're now working on this little side area, and I definitely struggled here and still wonder how I feel about this spot. I made it to where you can just hop over, but I only did that because having two bridges so close felt a little silly. My original plan in the layout drawing video I did recently was to have the church accessible from the post office, but found myself fighting with the amount of space that I ended up actually having. I worry that it isn't defined enough as a pathway. I think I need to get like a little angled signpost that I can put down next to the stone bridge that will let people know that the church is down below, and I feel like the museum variation of that item looks close enough to the church building itself. This is another area that I am just cluttering up with miscellaneous items and designs, trying to create a visual tree line to separate Chops' post office from this transition. I mentioned it in my previous speed build, but I seriously love Chops so much. I'm coming around to a lot of the pig villagers lately, like Kevin when I had him on Pottsfield, and now I've got this little mustachioed dude. Back in 2020, it was a very normalized by the community to hate any villager that wasn't pastel or had a normal cutesy appearance, which there's nothing wrong with gravitating towards those villagers, but the hate back then was near vitriolic, and I find myself now drawn to ones that have a bit more visual interest going on. A lot of villagers I used to staunchly dislike, I am now loving, like Lionel, Chops, Hazel, and even the frog villager Gigi. Like, something about her is just so slay. I don't know why, but I'm kind of obsessed with her right now. Do you have a favorite villager that you think is underappreciated or overlooked? If so, let me know down below so that we can hype up these forgotten villagers. I am now just finishing up this area beside the river and the cliff with some foliage, and I think what makes this island so difficult is that I want to fill areas in with trees, but my design spaces end up so narrow that I can usually only place one or two before I run out of space. I try to not line trees up side by side, often because it can look very unnatural, so I usually try to off-center them from each other whenever possible. Of course, I'm just going through now and placing my last couple of items, getting my trees in the ground. I still really love the use of the rock items to kind of create that separation of space. I wish that we had some better rock items in game. I feel like this video is turning into me just complaining about what we do and don't have in Animal Crossing, and kind of giving some Nintendo hate, but yeah, I just wish that we had rocks that felt and looked more like rocks. Those ones look like just like plastic set pieces that you would use when you landscape, you know, like the fake ones that you can like hide your key under or something like that. I just wish we had like a natural, normal looking boulder, but anyway, I am losing the script a little bit. We are now moving on to the lower tier, and I mentioned that this build is heavily inspired by a ruined church build by 𝒷𝓊𝓃𝓃𝓎 Creates, and I knew when planning Bleakmore that an abandoned church would be the perfect build to include on the island. Building it out made me feel so inspired to do an entirely overgrown ruined island in the future, featuring villagers like Coco, Roswell, and Lucky, but that is an island idea that we will need to put in our pockets for later. I wanted to create something like the church ruins and the abandoned abbeys that you can find scattered along the highlands of the British Isles, and it just made Bleakmore feel even more like a Western European town in the throes of the 19th century. This brings me to a recent historical connection that I made for Bleakmore while I was working on one of my Instagram story posts for the island, which, if you do not follow me over on Instagram, I am posting pictures from Bleakmore over there with little captions questions, you can find me at 𝒷𝓊𝓃𝓃𝓎, and you can kind of get a feel for the story that we have going on for �𝓊𝓃𝓃𝓎. But it just gave me a little like backstory puzzle piece for the island. So curl up for just a moment for a little history lesson about the year 1816, a time known as the year without summer. So in Indonesia, you can find a volcano that is named Mount Tambora, and it's a volcano that's still active today. But back in 1815, Tambora was readying itself for this massive eruption, and of course it started out like all volcanoes do, with, little tremors and small lava flows as the pressure inside the volcano kept mounting and mounting. Mount Tambora is located in this place called the Ring of Fire, which is a geological belt of volcanoes that line the Pacific Ocean, and it's where most volcanic eruptions and earthquakes happen. I think it's because that's like where one of the big fault lines in the Earth's crust is. Don't quote me on that. This is just how I understand it, but fatefully, on April 5th of 1815, the largest volcanic eruption in recorded human history happened. To put into perspective how massive this rupture was, the explosion blast could be heard over 1,600 miles away, which, for reference, Key West, Florida to New York City is only 1,400 miles, or Florence, Italy to London is exactly 1,500 miles. So as you can imagine, the destruction wrought on the local landscape was devastating, and this eruption had lasting effects for the entire world. It's important to mention that in the same year, Tambora wasn't the only volcano to erupt, and in the end, the amount of ash and volcanic debris was so dense that it caught in the Earth's atmosphere and cooled the global temperature down at a staggering rate. But let's jump forward to 1816. With the temperatures plummeting in the Western world, still reeling from an influx of tragedy from things like the Napoleonic Wars and the French Revolution, most of Europe was just not equipped for what was about to happen. Heavy rains and freezing temperatures destroyed the crops and harvests of that year, which led to a famine that resulted in riots and chaos, and it was made worse by outbreaks of diseases like typhus that just simply ravaged everybody. Like, everyone was prone from the cold and the hunger that diseases were able to take hold, and it was just a wild time. Like, I truly don't envy anyone that lived in that time, but I do find instances like that really interesting to look back on retrospectively. And really quickly, I need to pause because Lyman was seriously bothering me here so bad, and I sadly had to bully him out of his little spot because Lyman's house is nearby, which meant that he was like all up on me. He was definitely keen on keeping me company during this time and this entire build process, and he just refuses to leave. You'll see later that Eric has a thought bubble on his head, and I was like, why can it not be Lyman? Like, Lyman literally refuses to think about it. Every single villager on �𝓊𝓃𝓃 has thought about it except for Lyman, and I'm just like, what the heck, dude? Get out of here. But yeah, back to the point at hand, and what I was trying to get at here is I was using this year without summer as kind of a justification for why 𝒷𝓊𝓃𝓃 seems to be in this eternal blizzard, especially from the standpoint of how I am writing out the scenes on the Instagram post that I'm making. And also, it's just one of those like cool history trivia fact things that I know that I want to share because I feel like it's something that I never learned in school. I don't know if it's something that you've ever heard of before, but like, hey, this crazy thing happened in 1816 to garner it to be called the year without summer, which is like such an intense and dramatic name. And I don't know, like on YouTube, my watch for you page situation is just so broad because I watch so many different types of YouTube videos. I spend most of my time on YouTube, honestly, while I'm recording, while I'm editing. I will usually have a YouTube video playing in the background, so I listen to a lot of stuff, and this was one that really piqued my interest a few years back, so I don't know, I wanted to share it, and I felt like it made sense, and it kind of like explained some of the things going on in �𝓃𝓃. But also, it's really cool. Like, it's just so wild to think of something like that happening so close to modern times. I know you don't hear the year 1816 and think of modern times, but like only a few decades later, the turn of the century would happen, which of course feels like lifetimes away, but in the grand scheme of history, it was only a couple hundred years ago, which isn't that far away. And like, I just feel like it's so easy to remove ourselves from like the Victorian era because of the like massive amount of advancements that humans have made technologically in the last 50 years, but also like 1924 was only 100 years away. Like, that was not that long ago, you know what I mean? And I don't know, I just once again mention all of this because it was just a big point of inspiration for me when working on �𝓃𝓃𝓃 and this specific area. I feel like it was one of those factoids where like musing about it and thinking about it got me very inspired to work on this build, and I just really wanted to capture that feeling of like an eternal winter or a city stuck in the ice and snow in 1816. And history has always been a passion of mine, if you couldn't tell, and I feel like that's because I'm a storyteller and I'm a writer, and history is nothing but stories that, it's lives that have been lived, and I find comfort knowing that the human experience has kind of like existed in perpetuity since the beginning. Like every human, whether they lived in Mesopotamia or the Middle Ages or the turn of the century, they've all felt the exact same things that we are feeling right now in 2024. And I just think that that's so amazing that we all as humans have this connective thread that binds us all together. We all feel pain and we all laugh. We have loved ones and we experience negative emotions and all of these things. And working on this build just really reminded me of that and kind of helped me feel connected to the island that I was building, along with like myself in history. And I hope that these rants are fun to listen to and not like snoozing through a boring history class. I just felt really inspired to talk about it. I don't know why. I don't even know how I ended up on this tangent, but let's focus back on the build. So the spot that we're working on right now is probably the one that gave me the most trouble. This was actually the area that made me step away from the church entirely and go and work on a different spot on the island. And at the end of the day, I am really proud of how this area turned out, which usually tends to be the case. If I struggle with something, the end product that ends up happening is, it exceeds my expectations because of how much I struggled with it originally, and this is no exception to that rule. So originally, my boyfriend had suggested, when I came to him and told him that I was struggling with this area, he was like, why don't you do like a spooky little altar situation, because there's supposed to be a graveyard nearby. And I played around with that idea, but I didn't know how to do that without it looking almost comical. I don't really know how to describe it. It's just that Bleakmore isn't really supposed to be a spooky island. It's supposed to be more eerie. It's supposed to be more moody. It almost gives me the vibe of like an old, I don't know, like impressionist painting or a landscape painting from like the 1800s. So it's more so just supposed to be just a dark and gloomy island. So while yes, it would have made sense, I don't know, it didn't feel like it really fit. And so I really like what I went with the well over there. I think that it fits really well for this area, no pun intended.
Oh brother, this guy stinks!
And I just like the way that the trees are nestled around it. I feel like it almost creates this curve that really complements the simple well. And even though the simple well is an item that I've used already at the turnip farm, I just feel like it fits this space a lot better than something like a scary ghost altar would have. No offense to my boyfriend, I love you so much. But yeah, I decided to go with that, and I just think it fits a lot better. And of course, I went through and filled in the area with some foliage to really, make it feel nestled. I have really been enjoying doing that on this island, just making things feel like they're hidden in the woods. It's more of like you get to peek at something instead of getting the full picture, which I feel like really works for this island. And of course, I'm going through filling everything in, putting some more trees down. It looks really interesting right now because it just has this like super decorated area and then a bunch of nothing on the other side. But that's because the other side is where the actual church is going to go, and it takes up a lot of tiles. So I had to kind of just leave that open and work on the surrounding area first. Now we are going to go through and use some fences to outline this area, which I feel like really just brings this whole build together. I thought it was cool. We go through and layer the iron and stone fencing with some hedge fencing as well. I just feel like it really brings across that this is an old abandoned churchyard, and it just looks very Victorian with this layering of fencing. And of course we have Lyman getting in the way yet again. He is just asserting his dominance as I'm working in this area, which is super annoying. Now, of course, I am just finishing the kind of like outline for this area. This is really difficult because I hate the coastlines in Animal Crossing. I just feel like they're so hard to decorate around because they're all curved, and it's just really hard to figure out, if you're trying to do a structured build like this one, how to make those right angles when the beach coastline is so curved. So I tried to go through and do that to the best of my ability. I think it turns out pretty good in the end, but of course, I'm just going through and using up my last bits of fencing, clearing up some areas. Now, this little side bit that you can see right here is something that I did a long time ago. It was something that I had done when I was first trying to figure out the resident services build, and it's just one of those spots that I didn't feature on screen because it's so tiny. It's honestly really hard to record in tiny spots like that because my person gets obstructed so easily, and it just doesn't really bode well. Like you can't really like see all the stuff that I'm putting down. So that's kind of the stuff that I've been cutting out. But I'm going through now and putting some more foliage. This area is going to be the little walkway leading up to the church from the actual graveyard spot. And this is where things start to become really inspired by 𝒷𝓊𝓃𝓃𝓎 Creates. Now, I love what 𝒷𝓊𝓃𝓃 did with her version of her church. I think it's so cool. It's done more in this like medieval summery style, which I feel like lends itself very well to the rustic ruined items that we have in game. Of course, they have multiple different variations when you want to customize them. My favorite variation is the kind of like mossy version because I feel like it really just fits so well with that item. Now, of course, since we're working in the wintertime, I didn't want to use the mossy variation because I don't think that moss necessarily makes sense for a winter island. I feel like moss kind of like dies out in the wintertime. So that's why I've just been deciding to go with the more like white ruined furniture. I would prefer to use the mossy one though, because it looks absolutely incredible in 𝒷𝓊𝓃𝓃's original version. I think it just fits so well, and that's why I was super inspired to possibly work on a ruined island in the future. I think it could be really fun to kind of mix that city element with these more, rustic elements as well. And so I'm just going through right now and I'm making this broken up pathway. It was not the easiest thing to do. I love this brick pathing, but I feel like there aren't enough variations in the tiles for me. There's only about 5, and when you're working in a build that requires kind of randomness and a lack of repetition, it's really difficult to only use a couple of items or a couple of design codes to kind of bring that across. If you look at a lot of stuff in nature, the way that it's imperfect is because of the landscape around it and how nature has kind of like come in and affected whatever that thing is, whether it's rock formations or water. You kind of have to look at the surrounding nature to figure out what made it look so uneven. And I feel like that's hard to replicate in Animal Crossing because everything is just so perfect all the time. And I don't mean that in a negative way. I feel like it really lends itself to a great clean look and to things like, the more like pastel cottagecore types of builds and things where, everything's light and it's soft and it's cute. When you're working with kind of, I don't want to say more realistic islands, when you're working in something different, I feel like that is where things can become a little bit harder for yourself, because trying to imitate that natural style in this realistic way is just not that feasible in Animal Crossing, and I think that's why working on this island has been so difficult for me. In my head, I have a very strong idea of what Bleakmore is supposed to look like, and so trying to take that and interpret it into a game that is not built for this type of island theme can be a little difficult. Maybe it's just because I personally lack the skill to do so. Don't get me wrong, I love Bleakmore. I think this island is coming along beautifully, but at the end of the day, I don't know, I don't want to say I wasn't successful. It just feels like the vision for the island has veered away from what it was originally. Now, if you're new to the channel, or this is the first video you're ever seeing, or you haven't been keeping up with the Bleakmore kind of planning and things like that, the picture that first inspired this island is this one right here from Pinterest, and I love this picture so much. It is so gorgeous. I love everything about it. However, I feel like my first mistake with using this as my basis for Bleakmore is that it's an interior. It's not an entire island, it's not an outdoor space, it's an inside. So to try and base the exterior of my island off of an interior picture probably wasn't the smartest move for me to make, because I have to kind of infer what the exterior of this particular picture would look like. And that's what I tried to do with Bleakmore. But then, of course, things evolve and things change, and I kind of took it and used my own creative juices, I guess, to transform it into what it is now, which, of course, I love. That's why I say that even though it's different from the original idea, I think that it's still a beautiful island. But at the end of the day, I don't know, something about it just doesn't feel quite the same. I feel like it's taken on a life of its own, which I do really, really love. And I feel like that's kind of what's so interesting about island planning in this game is you could have one thing in your head, but then when it comes to actually executing it in the game, it's completely different. And that's something that as a creator I don't want to say struggling with, but it's more so something that I'm coming to terms with, because I've mentioned before on my channel that I am very much a perfectionist. So when something doesn't go according to plan, I kind of have a little bit of a meltdown. I kind of freak out a little bit. And this is an island that's teaching me that it's okay for something to be different or to not go according to plan. And it's more so just showing me how to come to terms with that with myself and just really learning how to tackle what I would consider to be negative emotions attached to those types of realizations and make it a positive thing. Alright, so we are starting the basis of the church right here, and I just started out by going through and kind of outlining the area with some pathing. I feel like the pathing really helps to make it all feel very integrated into the surrounding area, and I'm just going through and creating almost this cake shape with some terraforming. Now, I will leave all of the dimensions here on screen for you guys if you would like to recreate this in your own islands. I also have a list of the items that I used in the exact quantities here on the screen as well. And if you watch Kinoto's version, hers is a little bit smaller, I believe. I think I went through and made mine a bit bigger because I changed up a couple of the items here and there to better fit for Bleakmore, but just know that it is almost virtually the same, and she just kind of added stuff that felt a bit more summery, so I traded some things out for a more wintry feel. But the idea is basically a tier shape with the bottom layer being one tile wider and longer than the top tier. And if you're building this on your own island, I will recommend building it bigger than you think you will need. I would say add about 2 tiles maybe to each side, at least just to give yourself some room to scooch some furniture around, because it was a very difficult and messy trying to get everything situated properly. And I actually went through and built out this church, I would say 2 or 3 times, just to kind of figure out what the actual process was, kind of understand what the actual pieces were doing for the area, and it helped me in recreating it yet again and kind of tweaking the design a little bit. I feel like that's a pretty good piece of advice if you are seeing somebody build a beautiful building facade on their island and you want something similar on yours. Copy it to the T. And of course, if you want it to fit on your island, then you change it, because I feel like if you try to kind of watch what they do and then interpret it as you're building it out, I feel like understanding those core fundamentals of what the build has going on isn't really happening. So I feel like you kind of have to just fake it till you make it. And of course, if you do copy somebody, please give them credit. But I am the type of builder in Animal Crossing that subscribes to the idea that everything that I create in this game, I am sharing with the intent of it inspiring somebody or helping somebody with their own island, which is why I am pretty much okay if somebody copies what I do in Animal Crossing. I mean, there's only so many things that we can build in this game. It's kind of all virtually the same thing. It kind of brings us back to that thing that I mentioned earlier about how there is no such thing as an original thought, and that definitely applies to Animal Crossing. I hate to say it, I don't mean this negatively, but there is no such thing as an original build in this game, because with how many people play this game, I mean, I mentioned earlier that there was 40 million something copies of this game sold, and you're telling me of all those 40 million people, there is a brand new idea every single time? No, that's just not reasonable. So I'm personally okay if you guys use my stuff. Some people aren't, but my point at hand with this is to, copy those builds so that way you can understand the fundamentals behind the design aspect of them and then kind of tweak it to meet your own needs. I feel like that is a really great way to learn how to design in this game. And of course, I have talked through this entire thing. I'm going through now and finishing up with some different castle walls and everything like that. So the idea here is to kind of create this almost bell turret that you can see in a lot of classic churches, and the nuptial bell is perfect for this. I believe Kinoto used the brown variation, which I think looks a lot better for this build than the blue one. The blue almost looks a little too pastel, but it's the only color variation that really fit for the winter time, and regardless, I like it. I think it looks cool. I'm just going to go through really quick and fill in the actual pathway stuff. That way it kind of once again integrates with the rest of the build, and I feel like it just kind of alludes to, maybe there was some exterior walls that fell apart, and yeah, I just love this build so much. I think it's so freaking cool, and when you stand at the post office, you don't actually see this build all that much, which was exactly what I wanted, and this is what it all ends up looking like with the perspective. Alright, so time has moved forward quite a bit. I did do a lot of stuff off screen, filling in this beach clearly with wheat fields and some design codes, and that was because this was a area that took, once again, so many wheat fields, almost 2 entire inventories with a little bit extra, so it was a lot. And as you've probably noticed by now with the way that I edit my videos, I like to cut out the time that it takes for me to scroll through my inventory. I feel like it makes the video look a lot cleaner, and it would have been so much editing that I just decided to quickly take care of this and show you guys instead the items that I decided to place down. Now, I will admit, placing these gravestones was extremely difficult. For some reason, they did not want to sit the way that I wanted them to, but I'm just going through and using a combination of the Zen gravestone and the Western style gravestone. And yeah, I'm trying to make this beach feel very integrated with the other beaches that we have in game because, of course, all the beaches I've done so far have a bunch of wheat fields, and I didn't want this to be any different. But I would say my favorite part of this is actually these mausoleums that I'm building right here. I used a combination of stonework kitchens, some doors, and some broken pillars to kind of mimic the mausoleum look that you could see in a graveyard. So this is the type of build that you could implement in a graveyard on your own island, especially during like Halloween or something like that. But yeah, I love this build. At first, I was very concerned because it looks interesting in this lighting, to say the least. I was not sure if it would end up working out, but once the beauty shots come along, just trust the process. It looks so good. And we are actually getting to that part of the video, of course. So without further ado, let's go and take a look at the beauty shots. Alrighty, my friends, that is everything for the speed build and the beauty shots. I do hope that you had a lot of fun today listening to me rant and just joining me as we finish up another area on 𝒷𝓊𝓃𝓃𝓎 that I am super proud of. I want to mention really quickly that we are fast approaching 2,000 subscribers, which is seriously so mind-blowing. I feel like just yesterday we hit 1,000, so to already be at this milestone is so wild, and I cannot thank you enough. I want to do a fun little video to celebrate and was inspired by my friend and fellow YouTuber 𝒷𝓊𝓃𝓃𝓎 to do a little Q&A. You can find all of 𝒷𝓊𝓃's socials down below. She makes amazing Animal Crossing content. Please go and support her channel. It would mean the world to me. But I think that it could be super fun to just relax and celebrate this upcoming achievement. So feel free to leave some questions in the comments down below. Whether it's questions about me, my video making process, tips for YouTube, or island designing, my favorites, and even just silly stuff like would you rather or pick this or pick that, I'm an open book. I'll also be making an Instagram and a community post asking for question submissions, so if you want some time to think about it, you can ask them by checking out my Instagram or my community tab, and of course, feel free to ask as many questions as you would like. I want to say a huge thank you to my newest channel member, Bethany, also known as 𝒷𝓊𝓃𝓃𝓎 on Instagram. If you enjoy my content and want to help support me and the content that I create, please consider becoming a member today. Thank you all so much for this mind-blowing and overwhelming support, and I will see you on the next video.